Hello everybody, and welcome back to the channel. My name is Amanda N, and today we're going to talk about the sleeping sickness epidemic of 1917, which is also known as encephalitis lethargica. This disease is said to have turned people into living statues between 1915 and 1926. Although I know we're probably all a little bit sick of pandemic talk, this particular illness is one that I found extremely interesting and thought I'd dive into. So let's take a look. One of my sources said that the disease was first described by neurologist Konstantin von Economo, and the source described this: a disease of the central nervous system marked mainly by pronounced somnolence, lethargy, myalgia, fever, stupor, ophthalmalgia, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing these wrong, and paresis. Both sexes are affected, onset at all ages. Cerebral onset. The clinical picture is often dominated by headache, dizziness, fatigue, severe muscle pain, choreiform movements, rigidity, and tenderness. Most patients recovering from the disease develop Parkinsonism and personality changes with disorder of behavior. The condition first occurred during World War, and by 1921, it had reached epidemic proportions in most European countries and in North America. At first, many confused encephalitis lethargica with the Spanish flu. The epidemic lasted until 1926. A similar epidemic occurred in Akureyri, Iceland in 1948 to 1949, and since then some isolated outbreaks have been reported in cities in England, Germany, and in New York State. Jean-René Cruchet, 1875 to 1959, first noted the disease in the winter of 1915 to 16 in French soldiers in Verdun, and in the spring of 1915, a few cases were seen in Romania. Emil Riedlich, from 1866 to 1930, suspected that this disorder and Redlich syndrome were variants of the same entity. The disease is now considered extinct. However, the etiological agent was never identified. I guess what I find so incredibly strange about this illness is that the etiological agent, or the thing that caused all this in simpler terms, is unknown. This disease didn't affect a small number of people either, but an epidemic of encephalitis lethargica spread around the entire world. It's estimated that at least 1 million people contracted the disease, while over 500,000 died from it. They were described by Dr. Oliver Sacks in the 60s as such. They would be conscious and aware, yet not fully awake. They would sit motionless and speechless all day in their chairs, totally lacking energy, impetus, initiative, motive, appetite, affect, or desire. They registered what went on about them without active attention and with profound indifference. They neither conveyed nor felt the feeling of life. They were as insubstantial as ghosts and as passive as zombies. Other sources say that over 5 million people were affected, and the majority of cases were in those ages between 10 and 30. There were higher incidences of EL in large cities, as opposed to rural areas, naturally. While 1/3 of those affected died during the acute stages of the disease, those who survived never returned to normal. Symptoms of the disease could advance incredibly rapidly as well. In one case, a girl walking home from a concert suddenly became paralyzed on one side of her body. Within a half hour, she was asleep, and she died 12 days later. Patients became dazed, confused, delirious, and most notably experienced an overwhelming desire to sleep. They would sleep for abnormally long periods of time, but they were aware of everything that was happening around them while they slept. Some patients experienced involuntary movements, vocalizations, muscle twitches, and involuntary eye and jaw movements. They also experienced pain in their faces and limbs, and they had visual and tactile hallucinations. Oddly, these patients also exhibited a sleep cycle reversal, whereby they slept all day and were awake all night. The bodies of other patients became rigid and exhibited what's called waxy flexibility, whereby they remained rigid but could be easily repositioned, almost like positioning a doll. While their faces were devoid of emotion, cruelly, they remained mentally intact. This is absolutely terrifying to me. to be completely aware of what's happening around you but unable to control your own body. Oliver Sacks talks about this at length in his book Awakenings, published in 1973, if anyone wants to take a closer look. But the fact that this seemingly happened so quickly and out of nowhere is incredibly alarming. It wasn't until the 60s when the drug levodopa, which helps Parkinson's disease patients, was tested. Dr. Sacks was hopeful that he found a cure, but within a few months, most patients began to have tics, involuntary movement, emotional instability, and the drug was discontinued. A German neurologist in the 20s, on the other hand, said that one qualifier he used was the fact that EL evolved in time. This was how he diagnosed his patients. It started with sleepiness, or wakefulness, then OGC, oculargic, again I'm sorry for the mispronunciations, but oculargic crisis, which can cause backwards and lateral flexation of the neck, a widely opened mouth, eye pain, tongue protrusion, things of that nature. Then there would eventually be a Parkinson's-like syndrome. However, in spite of all this research, the many patients, the studies, the relationship between influenza and EL, as well as its source, remain divided. One article states, examining the brains of deceased EL patients, doctors concluded that influenza might predispose a person to infection with encephalitis lethargica, possibly by increasing the permeability of the nasal mucous membranes in your nose, which allowed the encephalitic virus to enter more easily. More recent studies point to an autoimmunological trigger caused by influenza. Since 1940, there would have been only around 80 published reports of encephalitis lethargica worldwide, and some scientists conclude that only 14 of them actually fit the diagnosis of EL itself. Once again, as in the case with many of these older topics, sources disagree. Some sources suggest that influenza may have had a factor, whereas others state that the epidemiologic associations provide both positive and negative support for a relationship between the two illnesses. As worrying as it may be, it doesn't seem like this was the first time that EL had turned people into statues either, even if I certainly hope it's the last. Sacks' book lists several occasions that you can find online featuring EL or stone symptoms all the way back to the 16th century. Yet, despite EL not actually being a new illness, people still aren't sure what caused these outbreaks. Another one of my sources states, so far, the cause is unknown. Several opinions argued that it started from the 1919 influenza epidemic as either an acute viral or a post-viral syndrome. More recent work linking EL to a streptococcal infection may prove more compelling than the influenza theory. Although the last epidemic of EL occurred nearly a century ago, the cause was never scientifically established and remains a matter of controversy today. This makes diagnosis difficult and is one of the reasons why we do not know how many cases of EL there have been in recent times. We still see sporadic cases of EL today, however, some may actually be forms of autoimmune encephalitis such as NMDA reptor encephalitis, and therefore all suspected cases of EL should be tested. Though we can't say for certain, this does seem to most likely be the cause among all my sources, this influenza-related outbreak. I'm curious what you guys think though. Do you believe that this could resurface? Do you believe that this illness is still out there today? How can we know that it's been eradicated if we don't even know the source? Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Let me know if there's other weird, creepy illnesses that you might want me to cover, and I hope you enjoyed today's video. Hit that like button if you haven't already, and if you're new here, please hit that subscribe button. I come up with new videos every Friday. Have a good one, guys. Bye!